There's a conversation that comes up constantly in sailing circles, and it tends to follow the same trajectory every time. Someone mentions they want to cross an ocean, and within a few exchanges, the discussion has gravitated toward boats that cost more than most people's homes. Large catamarans, contemporary Bluewater cruisers loaded with full electronics packages and water makers and everything else. And the underlying implication is that without that level of financial commitment, you're not a serious candidate for offshore sailing. That implication is wrong, and it's worth being straightforward about why. The boats rolling out of production yards today are not the peak of offshore capability. In many respects, they represent the opposite. They're beamier, lighter, and more focused on interior volume than the designs that actually validated themselves across decades of serious ocean sailing. The engineering priorities have moved away from structural resilience and toward marketable living space, and buyers who aren't familiar with the history tend not to realize it until something goes wrong offshore. Meanwhile, some of the most genuinely capable Bluewater hulls ever constructed are sitting in boatyards and on broker listings at prices that would genuinely surprise you. Not because they've deteriorated, because the market doesn't know how to value what doesn't appear on a spec sheet. These 5 deserve your attention. The Contessa 26 doesn't make much of a first impression. Low to the water, narrow, understated in every visible way. Set alongside a modern 40-footer with its wide beam and elevated freeboard, it registers as a different category of vessel entirely, smaller, older, less relevant. The 1979 Fastnet race changes that assessment fast. That race became one of the most brutal storms in offshore racing history. 15 sailors lost their lives. Dozens of boats were abandoned. The fleet was scattered across the Irish Sea, in conditions that exposed the weaknesses of a lot of designs very quickly. Every Contessa 26 that started the race finished it, in a storm that dismasted, capsized, or disabled far larger and newer boats. Every single one of those compact, narrow hulls came through intact. The reason lies in the design itself. Jeremy Rogers and David Sadler built the Contessa on the principle that seaworthiness wasn't a feature to be weighed against comfort. It was the foundation everything else had to be built upon. The result is a hull with a narrow beam, a deep encapsulated lead keel that represents close to half the boat's total weight, and a form that moves through breaking water rather than offering a surface for it to work on. The righting moment is exceptional. When this boat gets knocked down, it wants to return upright. That's not guaranteed on many modern designs. The hull is solid hand-laid fiberglass, no core material, constructed during the period when yards used more material than was strictly necessary, because the long-term behavior of the material hadn't yet been fully established. That conservatism produced hulls that have remained in active service for 50 years, with minimal structural problems. The honest trade-off is the interior. There isn't much of it. The cabin is tight, ventilation requires active management, and the deck stays wet in real conditions because the boat sits low and doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. This is not a boat for sailors who place comfort at the top of their priority list. It's a boat for sailors who are focused on arriving. For a solo sailor operating within a tight budget, who needs confidence that the boat will manage serious conditions without outside assistance, the Contessa 26 is one of the most straightforward answers available. The Albin Vega 27 emerged from Sweden in the mid-1960s and carries one of the more credible offshore track records of any production boat at this size. Northwest Passage transits, high-latitude sailing, crossings that many boats twice its length would approach carefully. More than 3,400 hulls were built, which means there's a substantial history to draw on and a large owner community that has accumulated genuine knowledge about what the boat can and can't do. The design is centered on a long keel with the rudder fastened directly to its trailing edge. That configuration produces a specific and important consequence for solo sailing. The boat tracks naturally. It wants to hold a course without constant correction from the helm. On a multi-day passage, the difference between a boat that demands continuous tiller attention and one that will maintain its heading while you reef, navigate or rest is not a small thing. The Vega consistently leans toward the latter. The protected rudder is another practical benefit that experienced sailors tend to recognize immediately and newer buyers frequently overlook. On a modern boat carrying a spade rudder hanging below the hull, any grounding or contact with submerged debris becomes an urgent problem. On the Vega, the keel takes that contact first. The rudder is shielded behind it. That advantage matters most in exactly the situations you can't fully predict. The boat isn't heavy in the traditional full keel sense. It's built somewhat more lightly than the displacement designs elsewhere on this list, which gives it better performance in light to moderate conditions than those heavier boats can achieve. But the laminate is solid, the construction is honest, and it has clearly demonstrated its capacity for sustained offshore use over many decades. The interior, by small boat standards, is well thought out. Swedish efficiency is a reasonable description. A couple can live aboard a Vega for extended passages without the boat becoming suffocating. The galley functions at sea. Storage is sensibly placed. For a 27-footer, it makes better use of the available space than most boats of comparable length. If the Contessa is the specialist engineered for the worst conditions, the Vega is the versatile all-rounder that has quietly proven itself across a wide range of sailing environments. It's an underappreciated boat, which is part of the reason the prices remain reasonable for what you're actually getting. The Pacific Seacraft Flicker 20 is a boat that requires genuine willingness to set aside assumptions before evaluating it fairly. 20 feet is small. There's no credible argument to the contrary, and sailors who consider size a disqualifying factor aren't entirely wrong to do so. But the Flicker wasn't conceived as a small boat that ventures offshore. It was designed as a proper ship that happens to occupy 20 feet of waterline, and the distinction in Bruce Bingham's approach is evident in everything, from the displacement figures to the interior proportions. Most 20-foot sailboats displace somewhere around 2,000 pounds. The Flicker displaces 6,000. A full third of that is encapsulated lead ballast in a full keel. The displacement to length ratio is what you'd expect from a considerably larger traditional offshore hull. In practical terms, this gives the boat momentum and inertia that a light displacement 20-footer simply cannot produce. It moves through chop rather than being tossed around by it. The hull is solid fiberglass, built thick with no core material. The rig is proportionally oversized for the boat's dimensions. The transom-mounted rudder is straightforward to inspect, service, and replace when necessary. Every aspect of the construction was approached from the assumption that the boat would be used seriously and needed to remain maintainable by whoever happened to own it. The interior is the element of the Flicker that consistently surprises people on a first look below. High topsides and a substantial coach roof generate close to 6 feet of headroom, a remarkable figure for this waterline length. The layout delivers a functional galley, a double V-berth, and enough organized stowage for extended offshore passages. Sailors have completed both Atlantic and Pacific crossings in these boats. The size imposes genuine limitations on provisions and passage range, but the structural capability is not in any doubt. The practical case for a budget-conscious solo sailor is straightforward: modest slip fees, manageable single-handed operation, low running costs, and a hull built to a standard that's difficult to find in current production at any price. The Flicker isn't a compromise. It's a deliberate choice with specific strengths and specific constraints. that experienced sailors tend to weigh honestly. The Vancouver 27 is a more purpose-built design than the others on this list, and understanding why it was built the way it was matters. Robert Harris designed it in the early 1970s around a very specific brief, a couple planning to sail from British Columbia to New Zealand. Not a coastal passage, not a Caribbean circuit, a sustained offshore voyage through some of the most demanding water in the Pacific. The design reflects that intent throughout every aspect of its construction. The cutter rig is the most immediately visible feature. 2 headsails, a Genoa and an inner staysail, rather than the simpler sloop arrangement found on most boats this size. This gives the offshore sailor meaningful options for managing sail area as conditions deteriorate. When the wind builds, you hand the Genoa and carry on under staysail and reefed main, with the centre of effort balanced and the boat controllable. The Vancouver remains manageable in conditions that would have a sloop-rigged boat fighting its own rig. For short-handed ocean sailing, that capacity for progressive sail reduction is genuinely worth having. The hull is heavy displacement, full keel, with a vertical transom that maximizes waterline length. It drives through short, steep chop rather than being arrested by it, a critical characteristic in North Pacific conditions, where the sea state can be confused and unrelenting. Construction quality was treated seriously. Chain plates, bulkheads, and the deck-to-hull joint were all built to absorb the cumulative loading of sustained offshore passages, not just the peak loads that certification testing is designed around. Below, the interior is laid out around the reality of being at sea rather than lying at anchor. Everything remains accessible at heel. The sinks are deep, the berths are fitted with proper lee cloths. The arrangement prioritizes function over visual impression. It's a purposeful cabin, not comfortable in the marina sense of the word, but entirely livable for the work of serious offshore sailing. For sailors with genuine ambitions toward high latitudes, Iceland, Greenland, the approaches to the Southern Ocean, or those who want a boat with a specific design lineage for heavy weather work, the Vancouver 27 stands as one of the more credible options available at this price level. It was built for real conditions, not for the photograph in the sales catalogue. The Pearson Ariel 26 tends to be undervalued in the current market, partly because of how it presents visually. Long overhangs, low profile, the kind of classic lines that read as vintage rather than capable, to buyers who equate age with limitation. Carl Alberg designed it in the early 1960s, and it carries the same design DNA as his better-known Alberg 30 and 35, which is to say, the priorities were seaworthiness and balance, not interior volume. The full keel is integral to the hull, rather than a separate appendage bolted on below. This shapes the way the boat behaves at sea more than any other single design decision. The Ariel tracks on its own. Trim the sails properly, and it holds a heading with minimal helm input, a quality that compounds significantly on a long offshore passage, especially sailing alone when you can't maintain continuous attention at the tiller. Autopilot failure on a boat that tends to wander is a real operational problem. On a boat with this level of inherent directional stability, it becomes a much more manageable situation. The construction is Pearson's early fiberglass work, solid laminate, built conservatively, from a period when the company was building a reputation rather than protecting a margin. These hulls have demonstrated their durability across 60 years of active use. That's not a projection or an optimistic estimate. It's a documented fact about a specific generation of American production boats. The interior is modest. 4 berths, a functional galley, the essentials of offshore living organized into a compact space. There's no pretense about it functioning as a floating apartment, and experienced sailors generally find that honesty refreshing. The Ariel does exactly what it was designed to do, without unnecessary complication. In today's market, these boats remain genuinely affordable. The combination of Alberg's design credentials, honest construction quality, and reasonable asking prices makes the Ariel one of the more rational entry points into offshore sailing for anyone working with limited capital. 5 boats, 5 distinct takes on the same central argument, that offshore capability and affordability are not in conflict with each other, and that some of the best engineered Bluewater hulls you can buy today were constructed 40 and 50 years ago by yards that were building conservatively because they hadn't yet determined where the minimum actually was. The Contessa 26 is the proven heavy weather survivor. The Albin Vega is the directionally stable, well-rounded offshore cruiser. The Flicker 20 is the unlikely heavyweight, a small boat built to the construction ethic of something considerably larger. The Vancouver 27 is the dedicated passage maker, designed for specific conditions by a designer who understood them from the outset. The Pearson Ariel is the underestimated full-keel cruiser with a design pedigree that its current market price doesn't come close to reflecting. None of them is without limitation. All of them are capable of crossing oceans in the hands of a prepared sailor who understands what they're working with. The ocean doesn't adjust its standards based on your budget, and these boats have decades of evidence behind their reputations. If you've sailed any of these offshore, real passage making, not coastal day sailing, I genuinely value your perspective in the comments. How the boat responded when conditions turned serious, where the layout held up and where it fell short, what you'd approach differently with hindsight. That's the kind of grounded, practical information that actually helps sailors making real decisions. And if you want honest, experience-based analysis of boats, offshore sailing, and what genuinely performs when conditions stop being theoretical, go ahead and subscribe. That's exactly what this channel exists to provide.